Imagine waking up in the dead of night, paralyzed, a crushing weight on your chest. You try to scream, but nothing comes out. In medieval Europe, they didn't call it sleep paralysis. They said it was a demon sitting on your ribcage, feeding off your soul. This wasn't just superstition. For them, the night was a battlefield, and the enemy wasn't just fear. It was real, intelligent, and hell-bent on breaking you. By sunset in medieval Europe, everything changed. The market squares emptied. Doors were bolted. Even the church, the spiritual heart of the town, closed its gates until dawn. In a world without electricity, night wasn't a passive backdrop. It was a live dangerous, unpredictable, and full of meaning. Firelight was the only defense. Candles, rushlights and hearth fires offered limited glow, flickering against walls and vanishing into corners. For the average villager, the fall of night wasn't simply the end of a workday, it marked a shift into uncertainty. Beyond the reach of torchlight, the world became shapeless. Forests grew darker, paths disappeared, shadows lengthened, moved, and what could not be seen became feared. Night belonged to more than just thieves or wolves. It was thought to be the hour of spirits, demons, and damned souls. Theologians of the time, influenced by early Christian and pagan traditions, alike believed that demons were more active after dark. The Canon Episcopi, a 10th century church text, condemned nocturnal women who claimed to ride with the goddess Dione, interpreting these visions as demonic deception. By the 12th century, such tales were treated with increasing seriousness, especially in rural parishes where oral legends held sway over written doctrine. In the towns, curfews were common. Bells rang not only to mark the time but to remind residents to extinguish flames and retreat indoors. In Paris, the ringing of the couvre-feu bell, meaning cover fire, was a legal mandate to smother hearths, not just for safety, but to prevent unrest. With fewer lights in the streets, control over the urban population became easier, but fear grew. For peasants and nobles alike, sleep was not a private comfort, it was vulnerability. Darkness was thought to lower one's spiritual defenses. Many believed that sinful thoughts came easier at night and that demons preferred to tempt the soul when the body was weak. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed by many monastic orders, emphasized early rising and strict nighttime discipline. To fall asleep without prayer was, in some circles, to invite attack. In folklore, crossroads and forests took on sinister associations. These were liminal spaces, neither here nor there, and therefore, by popular belief, attractive to wandering spirits. Strange sounds in the dark, animal cries, wind through branches, creaking timbers were not easily dismissed. For a medieval mind steeped in both scripture and superstition, a shriek in the night could just as easily be a demon as an owl. The fear of darkness wasn't irrational given the context. Night was when bandits struck, when illnesses worsened, and when childbirth, without the aid of trained physicians or midwives, often turned fatal. There was little help, and even less hope, once the sun disappeared. To live without artificial light was to live with constant reminders of human limitation. The darkness was total, and so were the fears that filled it. This was not just a backdrop to medieval life. It was an active force in shaping daily behavior, belief systems, and the constant need for spiritual protection. Night was never new, was a threat waiting just beyond the fire. By the early Middle Ages, the Catholic Church held more than just moral authority, defined reality itself. For most in Christian Europe, the Church's teachings were not symbolic or optional. They were the framework of existence. And when it came to demons, that framework left no room for doubt. These were not metaphors for sin or mental illness. They were real, active beings, fallen angels cast from heaven, now loose upon the earth. St. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the 4th and early 5th century, helped shape the Church's early demonology. Drawing from both scripture and classical philosophy, Augustine argued that demons were spiritual beings, mortal, invisible, and immensely powerful. They couldn't create, but they could deceive. To Augustine, demons retained their angelic intellect but had turned their will against God. Their mission was now simple: to corrupt humanity, tempt the faithful, and spread chaos in God's creation. They were especially dangerous because they could mimic miracles, appear in dreams, and manipulate perception. By the 13th century, the intellectual weight shifted to Thomas Aquinas, whose Summa Theologica became a central theological reference. Aquinas systematized beliefs about angels and demons into a logical framework. He wrote that demons, being pure spirits, could not act directly on the soul but could stir the imagination, influence bodily desires, and exploit human weakness. They could not read minds, but they could observe behavior and predict temptations. Aquinas rejected the idea that demons had full control over people, but he did not deny their existence or influence. His teachings were absorbed into church doctrine and filtered into sermons delivered across Europe. For the average villager, these high-level theological debates were far removed from daily life, but their consequences were not. Parish priests distilled these doctrines into terrifying warnings. Sermons routinely reminded congregations that demons could inhabit abandoned places, stalk sinners, and disguise themselves as friends or lovers. Demonic temptation was not subtle, it was expected, and everyone, from the peasant to the monarch, was vulnerable. The Church's role as both spiritual guide and moral enforcer made it the gatekeeper against these threats. Confession, sacraments, relics, and sacred symbols became tools not just of piety, but of protection. Yet these very rituals also reinforced the idea that demons were everywhere, because why else would such constant defense be necessary? Theological teachings often merged with local superstition, pre-Christian beliefs in forest spirits, household gods, or ancestral ghosts didn't disappear with Christianization, they were rebranded. In Germanic territories, for example, the Alpa malevolent night spirit was folded into Christian demonology. In Slavic regions, the Mara, once thought to be a wandering soul or witch, became a demonic presence linked to nightmares. The Church tolerated some local customs but reinterpreted them through its own lens, often framing pagan entities as demons in disguise. This fusion of doctrine and folklore hardened during times of crisis. During plagues, famines, or unexplained illness, demons were the easiest answer. Theologians wrote treatises, bishops issued warnings, lay people lit candles and whispered prayers. At night, the Church wasn't just fighting sin, it was fighting shadows. By reinforcing the belief in demons, the Church extended its authority into the most intimate parts of daily life: thoughts, dreams, fears. Faith wasn't just about salvation, it was survival. And in the darkness of the medieval night, belief in demons wasn't irrational. It was what the Church taught. By the 12th century, medieval Europe had given a name to something many claimed to experience, but few dared to describe aloud: the incubus and the succubus. These were not poetic symbols of lust. They were classified by church authorities as real, malevolent spirits, demons that attacked sleeping victims for the purpose of sexual violation. The incubus, from the Latin incubare, meaning to lie upon, was believed to be a male demon who pinned down women in their beds, often rendering them paralyzed and mute. The succubus, its female counterpart, was said to seduce men in their dreams, stealing not just their seed, but their energy, will, and eventually, their soul. These entities weren't fringe folklore, they were part of accepted church demonology, reinforced by theological texts, confessions, and even inquisitorial records. Pope Innocent VIII's 1484 bull, Summis Desidera Ctesiphon, linked to the witch hunts that followed explicitly referenced sexual encounters between women and demons. The document paved the way for Heinrich Kramer's infamous Malleus Maleficarum in 1487, which treated the incubus and succubus not only as real threats, but as central to witchcraft. Kramer wrote that demons could collect semen from men as succubi, and later use it to impregnate women as incubi, bypassing divine order. It was a closed circuit of demonic reproduction that struck at the theological foundations of human sexuality. Testimonies from inquisitorial records across France, Germany, and Italy document cases where individuals confessed often under duress that they had been visited by such demons. Some described being unable to move during the attack. Others claimed to see the demon's form shift between human and beast. One woman in 16th century Toulouse claimed that a black figure entered her room nightly, taking her voice and breath before forcing itself upon her. She was not alone. Dozens of similar reports appear in parish and inquisitorial records, suggesting that the belief was widespread and deeply feared. The fear wasn't only about the demons, it was about what their presence implied. For women, these stories reinforced long-standing suspicions of female sexuality as inherently dangerous. Church fathers like Tertullian had labeled women as the devil's gateway, a view echoed in later theological reasoning. If a woman was visited by an incubus, she might be seen as spiritually impure, having drawn the demon through temptation, even if unwilling. For men, the succubus was often interpreted as punishment for lustful thoughts, proof that sin could physically manifest. Gender roles, already tightly controlled by the church and community norms, became further entangled in spiritual terror. Women were monitored for signs of demonic attention. Nightmares, sudden illness, or unusual behavior could all be red flags. Men, especially monks, were warned that even a dream could mark the beginning of damnation. Medical explanations did not exist. No understanding of sleep paralysis, trauma, or psychosexual stress. Instead, these experiences were absorbed by the only framework available: divine and demonic warfare. The body became a battlefield, and the night a time when demons came, not to tempt, but to invade. Behind the locked doors of medieval bedrooms, what happened after dark was often invisible to others. But confessions, writings, and sermons revealed that many believed they were not alone. And for those who cried out, in silence, frozen, terrified, ashamed, the church had an answer. The incubus and the succubus were not imagined. They were enemies, and they came with teeth. In pre-Christian Scandinavia and across much of Germanic Europe, there was a name for the crushing dread that struck in the stillness of night: the mare. Long before the modern word nightmare referred to a bad dream, it described something more specific, more terrifying: a supernatural entity believed to press down on the chest of a sleeping victim, paralyzing them and stealing their breath. In Old Norse, the term was Mara, and in Old High German, Mara or Mar It described a female spirit, often seen as a kind of demon or witch, who visited people in their sleep. The earliest surviving mentions come from sagas and folk tales recorded in Iceland, Sweden, and Germany between the 13th and 15th centuries. In these sources, the mare was not a dream itself, but the cause of an intruder that rode the sleeper, brought terror, and left exhaustion in its wake. This belief didn't arise in a vacuum. In an age without scientific explanations for sleep paralysis, hallucinations, or nocturnal panic, such experiences had to be interpreted through the existing framework of belief. If someone awoke, unable to move, felt pressure on their chest, or claimed to see a dark figure in the room, the explanation was immediate and cultural. They had been visited by a mare. The mare was blamed not only for human suffering, but also for livestock distress. Farmers sometimes said their horses were ridden by the Mara when they found them sweating and anxious in the morning. In response, amulets were used to ward off such visits, softened carved runes or iron tools placed beneath pillows or tied to barn doors. In rural communities, protection rituals against the mare became part of everyday life. These traditions persisted even after the spread of Christianity. Instead of disappearing, the folklore adapted. The mare was sometimes recast as a demonic agent or a witch working through dreams. In parts of 17th century Germany, courts recorded trials where accused women were said to have become mares, leaving their bodies at night to torment others. The accusations paralleled broader, which panicked trends, but retained distinctly local elements, tied to sleep and nighttime fear. Modern historians and sleep researchers now recognize that many of the symptoms described chest pressure, immobility, hallucinations line closely with what we call sleep paralysis. It's a neurological phenomenon, not a supernatural one. But in the absence of that understanding, the fear was real, and so were the consequences. People avoided sleeping on their backs. Some communities developed folk prayers or charms specific to warding off the mare. Others marked their doorframes with protective signs or used animal bones to repel evil spirits. The legacy of this belief system lives on in language. The English word nightmare once literally meant a nightmare, a nocturnal entity. Only in the 18th century did the term begin shifting toward its modern usage as a disturbing dream. But its origins remain rooted in the fears of medieval and early modern Europe. The fear of being watched, trapped, and suffocated while utterly helpless. And in that darkness, without medicine or explanation, the mare remained the only answer. On the medieval imagination, the bedroom was not a place of rest. It was a spiritual battleground. When the doors were shut and candles extinguished, vigilance did not, and it intensified. For the Church and much of Christian Europe, the night presented more than just physical darkness. It was the hour when temptations stirred, defenses dropped, and demonic forces watched in silence. Medieval theology viewed the body with suspicion, rooted in Augustine's teachings and reinforced by centuries of monastic discipline. The flesh was seen as inherently corruptible. Sleep, though necessary, left the soul unguarded and the body exposed. Any wandering thought, especially of lust, was treated not as private folly, but as a breach in spiritual armor. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed by Benedictine monks from the 6th century onward, instructed strict discipline regarding nighttime conduct. Monks were expected to rise before dawn to chant the divine office, keeping their minds engaged in prayer even during the darkest hours. Some ascetic orders, particularly in the 12th and 13th centuries, took it further. Accounts from Cistercian and Carthusian communities describe monks sleeping upright on wooden benches or with lights left burning beside them, not out of comfort, but to resist nocturnal sin. In broader society, similar beliefs filtered into daily practice. Candles and crucifixes were placed near beds. Psalms were memorized and recited before sleep. Saint Jerome warned that the devil does not sleep, and in sermons across Europe, preachers echoed this idea that demons prowled the night looking for openings. To fall asleep without confession or prayer was to leave the soul unguarded. These teachings shaped not only behavior but suspicion. A man tormented by lustful dreams could be accused of harboring Sonor, of having invited a succubus. A woman, waking with unexplained marks or fears, might be questioned about demonic visitations. Physical and spiritual states were interpreted together. Medical explanations were scarce, so the presence of demons served as a framework for everything from nightmares to nocturnal emissions. Church scholars debated the boundaries of thought and sin. Thomas Aquinas, in the Summa Theologica, distinguished between involuntary dreams and willful consent. Yet the fear remained. If demons could not read minds, they could still influence thoughts, especially in sleep. This created a culture of intense self-surveillance. Even one's dreams were subject to moral scrutiny. Women were especially vulnerable under this model. The belief that female bodies were more susceptible to demonic influence was reinforced by writings from church fathers like Tertullian, and later echoed in the Malleus Maleficarum. A woman who slept alone or claimed to suffer from disturbing dreams might be suspected of spiritual weakness or worse, of unwittingly becoming a vessel for demonic entry. By the late Middle Ages, these ideas were woven into broader fears of witchcraft and heresy. Nighttime behavior, once considered private, became part of the public record in inquisitorial trials. Confessions extracted under pressure often included admissions of nighttime visitations, whispered temptations, or unseen presences in the dark. To medieval minds, the absence of light did not mean the absence of witness. The soul was never alone, and, as the Church taught, neither was the bed in the early modern period. Possession and witchcraft were not fringe beliefs. They were widely accepted explanations for visible, often terrifying behavior, especially when it happened under the cover of night. Across Catholic Europe, the hours after sundown were feared not just for the dangers they concealed, but for the rituals they were believed to host. Demonic pacts, unholy invocations, and nocturnal visitations that blurred the line between heresy and hysteria. Possession cases surged in the 15th through 17th centuries, particularly among women and children. The Church taught that demons could inhabit the bodies of the faithful, not simply as punishment, but as tests of spiritual resistance. Some cases drew enormous public attention. In 1609, in the town of Loudun, France, an Ursuline convent erupted into chaos when multiple nuns claimed they were possessed by demons sent by a local priest, Aubain. They accused him of making a pact with Lucifer and using sorcery to seduce them in their dreams. The case ended with Grandier's execution by burning after a trial steeped in politics, fear, and a blend of religious and sexual panic. Such incidents were not isolated. In 1632, a young girl named Jeanne d'Ang, also in Loudun, claimed nightly torment from invisible forces. Her seizures, visions, and speaking in unknown tongues were interpreted not as illness, but as proof of spiritual invasion. Doctors were consulted, but it was exorcists who took charge. These public rituals became theater watched by crowds, recorded by clerics, and used as tools for reinforcing the church's power over unseen threats. Possession and witchcraft were often linked, particularly through the suspicion of nighttime activity. Demons, it was believed, were more active in the dark. Witches were accused of using these hours to perform rituals summoning spirits, desecrating the Eucharist, and flying to boots. Inquisitorial records from Germany, Switzerland, and the Low Countries frequently describe interrogations where women confessed under torture to consorting with demons at night. They spoke of being visited in their beds, marked by the devil, or carried through the air to attend secret gatherings. One of the most cited manuals of the era, the Malleus Maleficarum, warned that witches often committed their crimes after dusk. Heinrich Kramer argued that women, being spiritually weaker, were more vulnerable to demonic corruption. He described in detail how witches would initiate pacts, engage in sexual rites with demons, and return home before sunrise. These ideas were widely disseminated, influencing trials from Bavaria to Scotland. The fear extended beyond the accused. Communities responded with self-surveillance. Night watches were established in many towns, not just to prevent crime, but to report suspicious activity. A candle lit too late, an unexplained cry, or a woman walking alone at odd hours could trigger suspicion. In Bamberg, Germany, during the height of its witch trials in the early 1600s, nighttime denunciations became common. A single rumor could lead to arrest, interrogation, and, all too often, execution. Behind the theology and legal codes was a simple fact. People believed they were at war with invisible forces. When the sun fell and the towns quieted, the night became a stage for unseen struggles, whether through convulsions in a convent or whispered confessions under torture. The presence of demons was treated as real, immediate, and criminal. The church had its doctrines. The courts had their punishments. But for those who lived through it, the fear was personal and it did not sleep. In a world where demons were seen as active agents of tormentus, especially at night medieval, people did not rely on passive faith. They fought back. And they did. So with a toolkit of sacred defenses drawn from scripture, tradition, and centuries of Christian and pre-Christian practice, holy water was among the most widely used protections. Consecrated by a priest and infused with liturgical prayers, it was sprinkled not only during Mass, but in homes, bedrooms, and stables. Believers used it to mark doorways, bless beds, and repel evil before sleep. Church manuals from the 10th century onward emphasized its power. In the Roman ritual, formalized by the 17th century, holy water was described as a means to put to flight all the power of the enemy. The Psalms, especially Psalm 91, "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High," were frequently memorized and recited before bed. This particular psalm was believed to offer protection against terror by night, a belief reinforced by centuries of monastic and lay use. Psalm 23, with its themes of divine guardianship, was also common. Many households encouraged children to learn these lines by heart, not just as acts of devotion, but as nightly shields. Physical symbols played a central role. Crucifixes were hung above beds or laid beneath pillows. Some people carried miniature reliquaries, small containers holding relics of saints, bone fragments, or fabric from sacred sites. These objects weren't decorative, they were protective. Items linked to saints like Saint Benedict or Saint Christopher were especially prized, believed to ward off demonic temptation and illness alike. One figure stood above the rest in these nightly battles: Saint Michael the Archangel. often depicted slaying a dragon or casting Lucifer from heaven. Michael was invoked in prayers designed specifically to defend against evil spirits. The prayer to Saint Michael, although formalized in the 19th century, has earlier roots. Medieval litanies and exorcism texts consistently called upon him. In many regions, his name was etched into household items, door lintels, or even worn on amulets. Apotropaic symbols, those designed to avert harm, were inscribed in walls, carved into wood, or painted onto personal objects. In rural England and parts of Germany, the witch mark or hexafoiler, geometric flower-like pattern, was scratched into beams, fireplaces, and door frames. It was believed to trap or confuse spirits. In Scandinavia, similar markings appeared near cradles to protect infants from the mare. The more extreme cases showed just how real the threat felt. Pilgrims returning from Jerusalem or Santiago de Compostela sometimes had crosses tattooed onto their hands or chests, not as decoration, but as spiritual armor. In 13th century Eastern Europe, records from monastic communities note cases of villagers requesting crosses branded into their skin. For these people, the war against darkness wasn't metaphorical, it was physical, visible, and constant. A market grew around these fears. Monasteries sold blessed candles. Traveling priests offered home blessings in exchange for alms. By the late Middle Ages, entire trades emerged to produce charms, medallions, and icons tailored to local anxieties, each stamped with divine approval, each sold with the promise of protection. For the medieval mind, spiritual vulnerability required active defense. To sleep without ritual was to risk exposure. And while the threats remained invisible, the countermeasures were tangibly anchored in faith, reinforced by ritual, and powered by centuries of belief. In medieval Europe, illness was never just physical. Especially when it struck at night, it was viewed through a lens of theology, superstition, and fear. With no concept of neurology, psychology, or microbial disease, the line between bodily affliction and spiritual attack blurred completely. The more violent or unexplainable the symptom, the more likely it was attributed to demonic activity. Epilepsy, then known as the falling sickness, was among the most feared. When a person convulsed on the floor, foaming at the mouth, their limbs thrashing uncontrollably, the explanation was not medical, it was possession. Augustine and later church writers acknowledged that demons could influence the body, and epileptic fits seemed to confirm this. In 11th century monastic texts, cases of sudden seizures were described as the devil taking temporary control of the flesh. Local priests were often called before physicians. Exorcism, not treatment, was the standard. Response: hallucinations, especially at night, were rarely considered products of stress or trauma. A woman who claimed to see shadowy figures while lying in bed was not pitied. She was feared. These visions, often accompanied by sleep paralysis or intense anxiety, were interpreted as the work of nocturnal demons or witches. People whispered of the Mara, the incubus, or the devil's mass. And when the victims spoke of pressure on their chest or voices in their ear, it was seen not as imagination, but as confirmation. Mental illness, particularly when expressed through erratic speech, public nudity, or violent outbursts, received even harsher judgment. In the absence of psychology, madness was categorized as either divine punishment or demonic intrusion. Monasteries sometimes took in the afflicted, but so did local jails. Records from 13th century France and England describe prisoners shackled in churches, kept under the care of clergy who prayed for their release from evil forces. women bore the brunt of these interpretations. A woman suffering postpartum depression might be said to have drawn a demon through the act of childbirth. In 15th century Germany, a woman named Elsa Ruglin was accused of consorting with demons after she began speaking incoherently and refused food. Her condition, likely a mix of psychosis and trauma, was instead written into court records as evidence of spiritual corruption. She was executed in 1483. Even night sweats, a common symptom of fever or anxiety, carried ominous connotations. If the sweating came with delirium, it was said the body was battling a demon. In some regions, particularly in the Alps and Pyrenees, such symptoms triggered local rituals: blessed salts placed near the bed, windows flung open to release the spirit, and candles lit throughout the night. Doctors existed, but their authority was limited. University-trained physicians were few and concentrated in urban centers. Their methods, rooted in Galenic theory, offered little comfort against invisible terrors. More often, people turned to the church. The priest replaced the physician. Psalms replaced medicine, and diagnosis was not a matter of inquiry, but of faith. Demons didn't just torment the soul. They were blamed for everything the body could not explain. In the medieval night, suffering had no neutral space. Every cry, every tremor, every sleepless hour risked becoming a spiritual event. And in that darkness, healing wasn't always the goal. Survival, physical and eternal dash was. By the 13th century, a shift had begun in how people understood evil. It was no longer seen only as a distant force lurking in forests, fields, or pagan lands, but as something intimate, something present in one's daily life, inside the mind, and especially in the dark solitude of night. As literacy expanded among the clergy and the urban classes, and as the practice of private confession became more widespread, the devil stopped being a general threat and started becoming a personal one. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 made confession to a priest at least once a year a requirement for every Christian. This decree transformed the way people thought about sin and temptation. It wasn't just external acts that mattered, net was internal thoughts. Confession forced individuals to scrutinize their own desires, habits, and impulses. What couldn't be explained was often blamed on an unseen adversary. Personal failings, no longer dismissed as weakness or misfortune, became evidence of direct demonic influence. Manuals for confessors, like those compiled by Dominican and Franciscan orders in the 13th and 14th centuries, included specific guidance on how to identify sins influenced by the devil. These texts often describe demons as whispering thoughts, distorting dreams, or inserting temptations directly into the mind. The boundaries between one's conscience and external spiritual attack began to blur. The devil, it was said, adapted to each person's weaknesses: weed, lust, envy, and shaped his assaults accordingly. The writings of mystics furthered this idea. Catherine of Siena, a 14th century Dominican tertiary, wrote extensively about her personal battles with demonic voices and visions, many of which occurred during the night. She wasn't dismissed, she was venerated. Her experiences were seen as proof of her sanctity, and also of the devil's relentless interest in corrupting the soul. This personalization of evil was not confined to the cloister. In lay society, people began to describe demonic temptation using increasingly vivid terms. In some regions, especially in France and Italy, folk beliefs developed around the idea of a familiar demon, a spiritual parasite attached to a single person. Though this idea was never formal church doctrine, It echoed in sermons and private fears. Individuals began to believe that their failures weren't merely the result of their nature, but of being targeted by a specific, invisible presence. Nocturnal fears became more acute. The devil wasn't just waiting to act, he was already there. Watching it was common for people to describe heightened temptation at night. Alone, without the distractions of labor or prayer, the mind wandered. And when it wandered toward sin, many believed it was because the devil had spoken. Theologians like Bernardino of Siena and John Gerson spoke directly to these anxieties in their preaching. They warned that unguarded thoughts could open a door, and that the devil knew exactly when and how to enter. Spiritual manuals advised constant vigilance, even during sleep. People were encouraged to make the sign of the cross before bed, to recite psalms, and to keep sacred images nearby. Dreams were no longer innocent, they were sites of potential compromise. Confessors asked not only what a person had done, but what they had dreamed. By the late Middle Ages, demonic influence was no longer something that came from the outside. It had moved inward, into memory, into thought, into guilt. For the medieval Christian, the devil had become an expert in personalization, and the bedroom, once a place of rest, became the front line of an internal war. Sleep paralysis is no longer described as a demonic attack. Nightmares are no longer treated as visitations, and yet the fear remains. Today, we know what the medieval world did not. We understand how the brain moves between REM cycles. We can explain why the body freezes during certain phases of sleep. Neurologists can point to the regions of the brain responsible for fear, hallucination, and dream logic. And still, thousands of people each year report waking in the dark, unable to move, sensing a presence in the room. Many describe it the same way people did centuries ago, a shadow pressing down, watching from the corner, breathing close. Sleep paralysis affects roughly 8% of the global population. Despite modern science, the language people use to describe the experience has not fully changed. From Canada to Cambodia, Iran to Ireland, people still see figures in the dark, still feel the weight on their chests, still struggle to explain what happened. The phenomenon is universal, but the cultural interpretations vary. In Japan, it's called kanashibari. In Egypt, it's attributed to a spirit known as jinn. In the American South, some still speak of the old hag. In each case, the explanation tracks closely with medieval ideas of night demons. Psychologists suggest that this persistence is not random. It's deeply tied to the architecture of the human mind. The fear of the dark, of unseen watchers, of being vulnerable while asleep. These are ancient instincts. They predate organized religion. They cut across geography, language, and even time. What medieval Europe labeled as demons, we might now classify as neurological misfires, but in both cases, the experience is real. The terror is immediate, and the mind searches for anything to assign blame. Even popular media continues to reflect these patterns. Films, urban legends, and horror fiction are filled with shadows that enter bedrooms, figures that stand at the foot of the bed, eyes that open in the dark. The same motifs appear again and again, not because they're trending, but because they resonate with something that never went away. The church may no longer preach that incubi lurk in the night. Courts no longer prosecute witches for summoning spirits after dark, but the primal fear remains. The vocabulary has changed. The fear has not. What does that say about us? Perhaps it says that beneath centuries of theology, science, and reason. Some parts of the human mind remain untouched, still waiting in the dark, listening for footsteps that never come, and wondering if something just moved in the corner of the room.